The millennial man sat in his cluttered study, surrounded by ancient scrolls, cracked timepieces, and dusty books that had long since lost their covers. His fingers, though long and gnarled from centuries of use, fumbled through yet another forgotten scroll he had uncovered from the back of an overstuffed shelf. He had not realized how much time had passed since he last paid attention to these relics, not that it mattered to him. Time had always been a strange companion. That day, however, something was different. The millennia had been kinder than most people would think to an immortal being like him. His youth, when it could still be called that, had faded long ago, replaced by a perpetual, perplexing age that was neither old nor young. His skin was smooth yet pale, and his eyes were sharp, filled with more wisdom than anyone could fathom. But his hair was a different story. It had been growing backward for the last 100 years, starting to fall out in thick, unruly clumps that left him looking like an ancient teenager. It was maddening. As he sifted through the scrolls, one old parchment caught his eye. There was something about it, the handwriting, a familiar swirl of ink he could almost place. It was his own. But the text was odd. As he read it, his stomach tightened. The end of time approaches. The clocks will stop, and all shall cease. No mortal or immortal can escape this fate. But fear not, for only one being may alter this course, and that being is the time merchant, the one who trades in moments and hours. The millennial man's heart skipped. He had long forgotten the prophecy, a random scribble he had written when he was much younger, or older, depending on how you looked at it. The memory of it flooded back, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had dismissed it as nonsense all those centuries ago, but now, after feeling so disconnected from time itself, it was all too real. He stood up, his joints creaking under the weight of his own centuries. The study seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing against his back as he realized the terrifying truth. The prophecy was coming true. Time was running out. Literally, the millennial man scrambled for the rest of the scrolls, looking for clues, searching for any scrap of information that would point him toward a solution. But it was no use. The end of time, the moment of stasis, it wasn't a matter of years. It was imminent. He stared at the text once more. The time merchant. The figure who could extend the flow of time itself. He knew he had to find him. But where? Who was this person who controlled time? The millennial man had lived 1,000 years, and in all that time, he had never heard of such a being. There were ancient timekeepers, oracles who claimed to read the future through clocks, but none had ever spoken of a time merchant. Fearing the worst, the millennial man decided to act. He had no time to waste. If the world was about to end, he had to find the time merchant before it was too late. He began his search in the strangest of places, not in grand libraries or hidden temples, but in the most mundane of locations, a small village tucked away in the forgotten corners of the world. He had heard rumors that someone in this village, an old hermit who had been around since the dawn of time, might know something about the time merchant. The millennial man found it odd that time could stretch so far in a place so small, but he was desperate. The village was quiet, with a few wooden huts scattered along dirt paths. It was a place that time seemed to forget. No clocks adorned the walls here, no ticking machines to measure the hours. People went about their day in a slow, deliberate manner, as if not concerned with the passing of time. It was almost as if they were outside its influence. At the edge of the village stood a crooked little hut, smoke curling from its chimney. The millennial man approached it carefully, his mind racing with questions. Could this hermit really know about the time merchant? Was it just another riddle he would have to solve? He knocked on the door. There was no answer. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing a hunched figure, an old man with a long, silvery beard and eyes that sparkled with the kind of knowing that could only come from someone who had seen centuries go by. "Ah, you've come," the old man said, his voice deep and gravelly, as though it had been untouched by time itself. "I've been expecting you." The millennial man stepped into the dimly lit room, which was filled with strange trinkets and symbols. It felt familiar, like the inside of his own mind, full of mystery and forgotten things. "I need your help," the millennial man said. "I'm looking for the time merchant. The prophecy says only he can stop the end of time." The old man chuckled, a sound that felt like it belonged to the earth itself. "Ah, yes, the time merchant. A very elusive figure, even for someone like you. You'll find him, but not in the way you think." The millennial man's heart raced. "What do you mean? How do I find him?" The old man's eyes twinkled. "The time merchant cannot be found by searching. He must be called. There is a ritual. A way to summon him, if you have the right elements." He paused, then added, "But it's not easy, and it comes at a cost." "What kind of cost?" the millennial man asked. "A cost in time, of course," the hermit replied with a wry smile. "The ritual demands rare ingredients, each more difficult to obtain than the last. And even then, there's no guarantee the time merchant will come. You see, time is not a thing to be trifled with. It is a currency, and it doesn't come cheap." The millennial man clenched his fists. He had no choice. He would gather whatever he needed, no matter the cost. Thus began the millennial man's quest to find the time merchant, a journey filled with obstacles, each more bizarre and absurd than the last. His first stop was the mountain of the Dragon of the Ages, a creature that hoarded centuries of time itself in the form of golden, ticking hourglasses. The dragon was a terrifying sight. Its scales shimmered like the night sky, and its eyes burned with an eternal fire. The millennial man, having lived through countless battles and confrontations over the centuries, was no stranger to danger. But this was something else entirely. Time itself seemed to warp and bend around the dragon's lair, as if reality itself was holding its breath. The millennial man approached cautiously, calling out to the beast. "I seek only a grain of time. A single moment. I need it for a ritual to save the world." The dragon's laugh echoed through the mountains. "A grain of time, you say? What makes you think you deserve it? Time is not a thing to be given freely. It must be earned." The millennial man swallowed hard. He had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. "I don't want to fight," he said. "I simply need your help. I'll trade anything. A century, an eon, I'll give whatever it takes." The dragon studied him for a moment, then, to his surprise, nodded. "Very well. You'll get your grain of time. But first, you must answer a riddle." The millennial man braced himself. The dragon's riddles were notorious for being impossible, yet he had no choice but to try. "Answer me this. What is the one thing that time cannot take, no matter how long it waits?" The millennial man thought deeply. For a moment, he felt hopeless. Time, in all its forms, could take anything: memories, life, even the very essence of being. But there was one thing that time could never touch. He smiled, his mind clearing. "Love," he said. "Time can never take love, because it's eternal." The dragon's eyes widened, and it bowed its great head. "You are wise, millennial man. I will grant you what you seek." The millennial man, now with the dragon's grain of time safely stored in his satchel, began his next leg of the journey. The road ahead was unclear, with no further hints from the hermit or the prophecy, but he had little time to waste. He had already encountered more than his fair share of absurdities on his quest. This journey was testing him in ways he had not expected, each new task pulling him deeper into the strange fabric of time's intricate weave. His next destination was a city that existed on the border between two worlds, the past and the future. It was called Chronopolis, a city that shifted with the changing ages, where buildings were both ancient and futuristic, and people walked through doorways that led into multiple eras at once. It was said that those who dwelled here had forgotten what time even was. To them, it was just another thing to be ignored. Chronopolis was a city of paradoxes. People went about their daily business, some dressed in clothes that looked like they were from medieval times, while others wore sleek, metallic suits that hummed with futuristic technology. The streets were narrow and winding, yet vast enough to contain whole epochs within them. Time flowed erratically here. One could spend a moment and find themselves a year older, or take a step back and relive a conversation they had just had. The millennial man had heard whispers that the keeper of the shifting hour, an enigmatic woman who guarded the entrance to the room of forgotten moments, might know where to find the time merchant. According to legend, the keeper was said to be a person who could remember everything, not just every moment, but every potential moment that never happened, every alternate possibility. He arrived at the entrance to the room of forgotten moments, a towering structure that seemed to stretch into infinity. The door was made of polished obsidian, its surface reflecting not just the present but also distant echoes of the past, flickering glimpses of events that had never come to pass. The millennial man took a deep breath, trying to center himself as he approached. The keeper was waiting for him inside, standing by an enormous clock whose hands had no definite position, perpetually swirling around like a hurricane. Her gaze was steady, and she didn't look surprised to see him. The millennial man was used to strange encounters by now, but there was something about this woman that unsettled him. She didn't seem to be of any particular age. She wasn't young, but she wasn't old either. She was timeless. "I've been expecting you," the keeper said, her voice both soothing and unsettling. "The time merchant is closer than you think. But before you find him, you must face the trials of the room." The millennial man furrowed his brow. "Trials? What kind of trials?" "The trials of memory," she replied. "For the time merchant deals in more than just time itself. He deals in what could have been, what was never meant to be, and the choices that everyone must face." The keeper motioned for him to step forward, and the moment he did, everything around him shifted. The room of forgotten moments was no longer a quiet, infinite hall, but instead transformed into a landscape of swirling images. Memories, both his and others, hovered in midair like fragments of a shattered mirror. Faces he'd once known flashed before his eyes, moments of joy and heartbreak, the beginnings and endings of relationships that were once significant but now felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. "This is your first trial," the keeper intoned. "Here, you will face what you have lost, what you might have had, and the choices that shaped your immortal existence. You must walk through it, or be trapped forever in these moments that never fade." The millennial man felt the weight of the images pressing on him. He had lived for 1,000 years, seen empires rise and fall, watched friends grow old and die, witnessed the endless passage of time. He had never been able to hold on to anything for long, for he had outlived all of it. He had spent centuries searching for answers, for meaning, for something that would tether him to the world he once knew. But time, in its infinite cruelty, had always moved forward, leaving him behind. He closed his eyes, letting the images wash over him, but they only became clearer. Faces he had long forgotten surfaced like ghosts from the past. There was Iris, the woman he had once loved, who had died when he was still in his prime. There was Crispin, the young boy who had been his companion in the early days, but who had perished in a foolish skirmish with bandits. There were the countless friends, lovers, and strangers who had crossed his path, each one a fleeting moment in his long existence. A particular image lingered, his own younger self, laughing with a group of friends in a meadow. He had been so full of life, so hopeful. It was a version of him that he had almost forgotten. That version of himself, so full of potential, seemed like someone entirely different. He realized with a jolt that he didn't even recognize that person anymore. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" he asked, his voice heavy with the burden of centuries. "Let go," the keeper said simply. "You are here because you are still tied to these moments. If you wish to find the time merchant, you must let go of what is holding you back. Only then will you understand the true nature of time." It was the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do. The millennial man had always believed that his immortality had granted him the power to hold on, to preserve what was meaningful. But time, as the keeper had said, was not meant to be held. It was meant to flow, to change, to be lived. With a deep breath, he let go, the images faded, and the room returned to its calm, swirling clock. The keeper was watching him closely, a faint smile on her lips. "You have passed the first trial," she said. "Now, you are ready to face the second." But the millennial man felt a weight lift from him, a sense of clarity he hadn't known for centuries. He had faced his past and let it go. He was no longer burdened by what was lost, by what he could never regain. He was free. The millennial man moved through the shifting streets of Chronopolis with renewed clarity. The weight of the past had finally been lifted, and the oppressive fog of time no longer clouded his thoughts. He had let go of the things that held him captive, the memories, the regrets, the lives he had outlived. In this strange city where moments were as malleable as the air, he felt a quiet peace settle over him, a sense of purpose he had not known in centuries. The time merchant was close now. He could feel it, like an invisible force pulling him forward. He followed the winding roads that seemed to loop back upon themselves, as if the city were a labyrinth designed to confuse even the most seasoned travelers. The air hummed with an odd energy, as though the fabric of time itself was taut, ready to snap. There were no signs to guide him, no hints to point the way, only the unshakable feeling that every step he took was one step closer to the end. And the beginning. The streets became narrower, and the buildings older, their edges softened by the wear of centuries. It was as if the city were closing in around him, as if the boundaries between past, present, and future were dissolving altogether. He rounded a corner and found himself standing before a massive, ornate door, its surface gleaming with a strange light. It was different from anything he had seen in Chronopolis, carved with symbols that seemed to bend and stretch with the passage of time. This was it. The millennial man took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside was a vast chamber, the walls lined with clocks of every size and shape. Some were tall and elegant, their brass hands sweeping in perfect motion, while others were broken and rusted, their faces cracked and shattered. Time hung thick in the air, as if every second had been distilled into the very fabric of the room. At the center of the chamber stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, his face hidden beneath a hood. The figure stood perfectly still, as though frozen in time itself. "You've come," the voice came from the figure, deep and resonant, as though it carried the weight of eternity itself. The millennial man stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I need your help," he said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "The end of time is near. The world is about to stop, and I'm the only one who can prevent it. I need you to extend time, to save everything." The figure remained silent for a moment, as though considering the request. Then, slowly, he lifted his hood, revealing the face of an ageless man, a face both familiar and strange. His eyes glowed with an eerie light, an otherworldly depth that seemed to pierce straight into the millennial man's soul. "I know why you've come," the time merchant said, his voice calm and unhurried. "But you must understand, time is not something to be bargained with. It is not a simple matter of extending or shortening. Time is a river that cannot be stopped, no matter how powerful the current. The world is ending because it must. It is the natural order." The millennial man felt a surge of frustration, his heart beating faster. "But if I don't do something, everything will be lost. All the lives, all the moments, they will be erased. How can you just stand by and let that happen?" The time merchant regarded him with an inscrutable expression, his glowing eyes flickering with something like sympathy. "You believe you can control time. You believe you can save it. But time is not yours to save. Time belongs to no one." The millennial man's fists clenched at his sides, his patience wearing thin. "Then why are you here?" he demanded. "Why do you even exist if not to help people like me, to prevent the end?" The time merchant stepped forward, his movements deliberate, almost measured. "I exist because I am the keeper of time's balance. I do not control it. I do not alter it. I merely observe it, as it unfolds. You cannot fight time, millennial man. You cannot stop it. But you can learn from it." "Learn from it?" The millennial man's voice was incredulous. "What is there to learn? Time is ending. There is no lesson in that. The time merchant's eyes glowed brighter for a moment, and a deep silence filled the chamber. Then, with a slow, deliberate gesture, he raised his hand, and the clocks around them began to chime in unison, their hands ticking backward, rewinding the fabric of the room. The millennial man stumbled back, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible sight. The clocks spun faster, their ticks becoming a blur, until everything around him began to unravel, the past, present, and future all bleeding into one. "You think you know what time is," the time merchant said, his voice echoing through the chamber as the clock spiraled. "But time is not a line. It is a circle, a constant loop, a never-ending cycle. The world does not stop, millennial man. It merely changes. What you see as an ending is only another beginning." The millennial man stood frozen, his mind racing as he watched the scene unfold before him. The past, the present, the future, they were all intertwining, collapsing into a single moment. And then, as if he had been struck by a sudden realization, it all clicked. "The end is not the end," he murmured, understanding dawning on him. "The cycle, it never stops. It just keeps going, over and over again." The time merchant nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Exactly. The end of time is not truly an end. It is a transition, a shift into something new. The world is not meant to last forever. It is meant to evolve, to transform. You, too, are a part of that transformation." The millennial man's chest tightened as he took in the enormity of the revelation. The prophecy, the end of time, it was never about stopping the inevitable. It was about accepting it, embracing the change, and moving forward. "So," he said, his voice hoarse with the weight of understanding, "there's no way to stop the world from ending?" The time merchant's smile deepened. "There is no need to stop it. The world will continue, just as it always has. Time cannot be stalled, nor can it be preserved. It must flow, unimpeded. And that is the gift I offer you." The millennial man felt a surge of clarity wash over him, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Time would not be stopped. The world would continue, but it would be different. He had spent centuries trying to hold on to the past, trying to grasp the fleeting moments that had slipped away from him. But now, he understood. He could not hold on to time. He could only experience it. "I see now," he said, his voice calm and resolute. "It's not about saving the world. It's about living in it. About moving with time, not against it." The time merchant nodded once more. "Exactly. And now, you are free." As the words left the merchant's lips, the chamber around them began to dissolve, the clocks slowing to a halt. The room became still, and the millennial man found himself standing alone, the air thick with the weight of his newfound understanding. He had come seeking to stop the end of time, but instead, he had learned to embrace it. The time merchant's voice echoed in his mind, "One final piece of advice. Remember, millennial man, time is not your enemy. It is your companion. Live in it, learn from it, and it will carry you forward." And with that, the millennial man was alone. But this time, he was not afraid. He had learned what it meant to truly live.